Okay, I'm Kathryn Boughton, and we're here today talking to Fred Perkins, a longtime businessman in Canaan. And we hope to find out a lot about the early history of the automobile industry today.
Fine. You mentioned that I had been in the business for a long time, but the family preceded me. My mother's brothers were the original Brewer brothers that started the automobile business in Canaan in 1911. I guess it's, nobody's sure whether it was 1911 or 1912, but somewhere back there. They left the farms up in southern Berkshires and came to Canaan to start the car business. And it's been in the family ever since, including my dad, who finally married into the family and was there for nearly 60 years. And I came into the business in the early 50s.
Now, as I remember it, your family dealt with Rios. Is
That's
that right?
That's my earliest memory of a family car was a Rio Flying Cloud that the wheels were higher than my head, and it had the horsehair upholstery, and you could stand up and bounce on the rear seat and pull down little window shades, and there was a little vases where you could put rosebuds in.
Oh, wow,
and,
that's wonderful.
Two big spare tires on each front fender, but that was the early 30s. And
how many horsepower would that car have been?
I can't imagine, but they had plenty of power. I do remember one day, though, that my mother got stuck in the mud up on Brush Hill that required a few horses to pull us out.
Now, those were the days when cars were put up on blocks during the winter and you didn't really take them out after November, perhaps?
And my early memory of the car business, nobody bought a car during the winter.
Even in the 50s?
Well, in the 50s it had improved, but still people didn't want to get their new car until after the mud season. They would buy a car, but they'd want us to keep it until the 1st of April.
That's great. I never realized that. Do you remember when little amenities like air, heat and windshield wipers and those things came in?
Well, a lot of the early cars before World War II had manually operated wipers.
Oh, really?
You moved a little lever by hand to make the wipers go.
That would have gotten tiring.
But they had vacuum windshield wipers in the early days. Of course, they would kind of fade out on you when you stepped on the gas, but the electric wipers were pretty much standard equipment after World War II. But heaters, the early heaters sometimes were just a hole from the engine compartment into where your feet were to get a little warm air off the motor. Then they had finally electric fans that would blow the air around a little bit, but the windshield still steamed up.
Yep. We have a tape of Louis DeBarbery talking about driving down to get the fresh fruit and vegetable about 4 o'clock in the morning, and he would have to hold a candle against the window to heat it.
One of the things that was popular in the late 40s was a little electric fan with rubber blades that were mounted up on the dashboard.
I remember those.
It would blow a little breeze across the glass. But
I'd forgotten that.
But actually, even in the 50s, when I started in the business, heaters were not standard equipment, and we used to install them locally after the car was built. And I can remember one day a lady that was buying a car thought that we built the cars. She said,
really?
I've seen your fellows out there with the car all apart where we were installing a heater, and she said, I see them putting them together right there in your shop. But one of the things we always used to have to look out for, if a car came in trade that had originally been in Florida, you better make sure there was a heater in it.
It's funny, I remember when I was very young and I used to go out on the milk route with my grandfather when we had snow days from school and things like that, my feet would get so cold, and it never occurred to me that there might not be an adequate heater in that truck. I just have this memory of frozen feet.
Yeah, well, they've come a long way today. Of course, air conditioning is almost standard equipment in cars today. There are very few cars sold without it. I guess it, as far as original equipment, is up in the high 90%.
Is it really?
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, we wouldn't stock a car today without air conditioning, including trucks. And they're pretty sophisticated now to take in outside air, and so the windows don't steam up. The air conditioning dehumidifies the car, takes the moisture out. They have a wide range of temperature control and where the air is going to come out.
Yeah.
And
they're like traveling
rear air
houses.
conditioning in the minivans, and so the driver can control it, or the backseat passengers, and so cars have become a lot more comfortable than they used to be.
A lot more comfortable and a lot more expensive, too.
Yeah.
I wonder how it compares in proportion to income. I mean, things obviously go in tandem. You can't sell a car for $25,000 to $40,000 if people are making 10. So it all goes together. But I know that Ford, when he first produced his car, had the idea that everybody could own one. And I wonder how it compares now to income then.
I would guess he was probably right, because I think maybe there's more cars than people now.
Oh, I think probably so. Most homes have 2 or 3.
2 and 3, and some families, all the children have cars. There might be 7 cars in the dooryard. But speaking about the pricing of a car today, I guess if you can believe all the statistics you hear, that it actually takes less of a person's income to buy a car today. I've seen figures on how many weeks you have to work to be able to buy a car, and it really is a better value now than it was years ago.
Now, the Brewers started the business in Canaan.
That's right.
And their names were?
There were 2 brothers, Gilbert Brewer, Bert Brewer, and his brother Fred Brewer. And there eventually was another brewer that came into the business in the 20s after he saw that it was a success. My uncle Ed Brewer, he decided he'd invest a little money in it, but the 2 founders of the business were Fred and Bert Brewer.
And they had been in the bicycle business, hadn't they?
They grew up on a farm with my mother up near the Cobble in Ashley Falls, the other side of the river. And I guess they saw what farming was like and decided that
there was a better way.
They came to Canaan and went in the automobile business. But it really started as a bicycle shop, and they did some repairs. There were very few automobiles then. I mean, Railroad Street was a dirt road until the 20s, I guess. And one of their bigger sources of income was livery work. And of course, the passenger trains came through Canaan then, and they would take their old touring cars and go to the station and deliver people around the villages to Norfolk or Salisbury. And they also did excursion trips up the Mohawk Trail, a day trip there where they would go up into the northern Berkshires and
Why, that must have been quite a trip in those days.
I'm sure it was, in the late teens.
Yeah.
And then they expanded their Rio franchise to Pittsfield and on up into Burlington, Vermont. And but the Rio vehicles, they had both cars and a full line of trucks. And the little delivery trucks and farm trucks were a big part of the business. In the mid-30s, Rio had labor trouble and finally stopped making cars, and that's when they connected with Chrysler, and we had a DeSoto Plymouth franchise and actually a distributorship where they sold cars to other dealers in small towns who who worked from small garages and that sort of thing. They distributed cars all through western Massachusetts and a lot of Vermont as well.
Now, they opened a third shop too, didn't they, in North Adams, was it?
Well, with North Adams, there actually were 4 places of business when they were in the height of the automobile expansion after World War II.
It's funny, I have a scrapbook that was given to me a couple of weeks ago to do a feature out of. The woman lived in Rhode Island, but she had Pittsfield connections, and she had a newspaper article in there about this doctor who had been hit by a car, and a Brewer Brothers employee was testifying that he maintained the car. It was so funny to get the scrapbook from the 1930s and have all this little vignette about Brewer Brothers.
Well, there was a lot of history to the company, and then in the early '60s, Chrysler stopped making the DeSoto, and so then that meant that we were able to get a Chrysler franchise in some of the places, and as the competition increased, we finally did split the company up and closed the place in Pittsfield. And that's where I started my part of my career, was in Pittsfield. I was there for 10 years. And
was there just more competition in Pittsfield than there was in this region? Is that why you closed in a bigger city than here?
well, we lost our main product, the DeSoto, and there was already another Chrysler dealer there, so there just wasn't room enough for that many dealers.
I see.
And Pittsfield was well, in those days it was a smaller city. There was a lot of competition from outside the city, Albany and Springfield, and it was hard to compete.
So you kind of consolidated back in Canaan?
Right. I decided that I enjoyed the business. My dad was at an age then when he was thinking about retiring, so I've been back here for 30 years now.
Wow, that time goes fast, doesn't it? Tell us about the war years and the Depression years. What kind of effect did they have on the automobile business?
Well, as you can imagine, jobs were very scarce. There were a number of cars at that time, and Brewer Brothers was able to survive through those years primarily by working on cars, which continued into the war years. People still needed transportation. They wanted to maintain their vehicles, so even though not a lot of new ones were sold, there was a lot of available work to keep the old ones going. But I think in the mid-30s there seemed to be some new interest in cars. The styling was changing. We got rid of the side curtains and got windows and doors and steel tops, and I don't know, you probably wouldn't remember at the time, but Chrysler came out with their airflow design, which was pretty radical, with a streamlined nose, and they built that for 2 or 3 years. It was certainly ahead of their time, but it did create quite a lot of interest in cars. So, and I suppose there were still people that could afford to buy cars, and trucks were important for commerce. So I remember, of course, I was born in 1931, so my early years at 5, 6 years old, I can remember that there was concern that the business was, that things were in tough shape, but it was along around 1937 some of the styling had changed and seemed to be more interest in new cars. Even in the late 30s, they were just before the war, they had some improvements. We started talking about automatic transmissions and
really, was it that early?
And I remember the Chrysler products had the fluid drive, which created a lot of interest. But of course, I was 10 years old when the war started, and automobile new car production stopped immediately. I guess in the fall, of course, of 41, the 42 models had just come out before Pearl Harbor, and so I don't think we had more than half a dozen of the new models. But
Those cars would be very valuable now, wouldn't they? I mean, if there weren't many of them made?
Well, true, although as I understand in the classic cars, the real value seems to be for the vehicles. When people get into their 40s and 50s and can afford to buy antique cars or classic cars, they tend to buy what they remember as a kid.
Yeah.
So cars from the 30s are kind of going out of favor more for the high performance vehicles that came
really?
out in the late 40s, early
wow.
50s. That seems to be where the most expensive, with the exception of the real classic
the T's and the
Duesenbergs and big old LaSalles and some of those cars. But right now, the part of the market that seems to be the most popular is the cars that Chrysler made in the late 60s, early 70s, the Road Runners and the GTXs and some of those cars.
Yeah.
But the war years really, my memories of that was the gas rationing, the fact that people didn't use their cars very much. I can remember we had a car that we kept in a barn right across from where your grandparents were in
The Pierces?
no, in Mildred Mather's barn
really?
there.
Oh, really?
And you know, it had the big swinging doors, and if it had snowed, it was a major project. And we didn't take the car out hardly even once a week.
Yeah.
I guess you had a rationing sticker for. An A sticker was 5 gallons of gas a week, so you didn't get too far from home.
No, in that car.
But in those days, you know, all of your groceries got delivered pretty much. You could phone in your order to the meat market, and Louis DeBarberry was around with these
Did they have
fruits and vegetables.
Have higher ration tickets? I mean, how could they afford to?
You had to go to the rationing board to state your case as to how you used your vehicle, and I know there was an A ticket and a B and a C, and I guess whatever was essential business, you could get more gallons. But I say the Brewer brothers survived those years by. I remember they did allow them to build engines for cars for. Regular consumption, and we used to get them as a carload and just
really?
replace the engines in the cars. That became a big part of the business. But of course, after the war, things just zoomed.
I bet.
I mean, the prices as well.
Everybody must have been so tired of the car they had.
Well, the price of cars, I guess, doubled. You could buy a Plymouth before the war for $600-700, and I remember the first 1946 Plymouth that came in was $1,300. So they had, I guess there had been that much inflation during the war years. But, and then since then it's continued.
Gone on and on. Now, did people change their buying habits? I know during the Depression probably people couldn't have afforded to change their cars too much, and during the war there was nothing to buy. When did we get into the time when people started to change a car every 2 or 3 years?
Well, I think that occurred in the 60s when cars again were plentiful. They'd caught up with demand, and I guess maybe that was encouraged by Detroit to have a new car every 2 or 3 years. And the styling changes, you know, if every year or two there were, you know, some radical ideas. It was the fins came in, and
the fins went out.
Yeah, but and I can remember, you know, cars were shipped with covers on them. It was a big effort made to keep everything secret till the announcement day, and the advertising would begin, and the dealer showrooms would have the windows covered and to announce the cars, and everybody'd come in to see what major change there had been done, and oh yes, I got to have that. But course, that's certainly all changed today. Cars are introduced whenever the manufacturer feels he's got it ready, and they might have introductions 2 or 3 times during the year. And but the mystery's gone out of it.
Yeah, yeah. People are also, I think, going the other direction and keeping cars longer again, aren't they?
Well, yes, the quality of cars has improved to the point of where they find that they can. I mean, it's not uncommon to see cars 150,000, 200,000 miles and still running fine.
Last year bought a car with 95,000 miles on it, and normally if anything had 95,000 miles on it, I would be terrified of it.
I figured it was worn out.
But the guy gave me a year's warranty on it, and I figured if he was going to warranty everything for a year on a car that old, it had to be good, and indeed it has been. You know, so it's an entirely different
well,
kind
I
of
think
car.
the thing that's most noticeable that the public are aware of is the fact that they don't rust out like they did. I mean, I can remember late 50s, early 60s, a car could have rust holes in it after 2 years. Today, it's at 10 years. They still, the paint may be sandblasted off, but the metal is still good. But what you don't see is the improvement in the mechanical part of the car, the engine tolerances and things of that sort make the motors last longer as well. And they don't require the maintenance they did. I mean, doing a complete engine overhaul, putting in rings and bearings, you just don't need to do that if the car has had any kind of maintenance at all.
It's an amazing change. I can't get over it, because the thought of a car that old for the amount of money I spent for it and with a year's warranty was just like, wow. But I imagine the used car market is better too, because of the cost of new cars and the amazing endurance of these vehicles now.
Well, used cars are really always in demand. I guess there probably is more demand for used cars than there's ever supply to fill the demand, because there's still, you know, a lot of good value in a 2 or 3 year old car, and the depreciation factor is let somebody else pay that.
Yeah, well, that's what I always think too. You know, why should I pay for the cost of driving it off the lot as a new car?
But it's usually difficult to find a car that's the model you want and with the mileage, because people drive so much more. I mean, we used to say 12,000 miles a year, then it got to be 15,000 miles a year was average, and now 20, 25, even 30,000 miles a year.
I put 30 on this one.
Yeah, there are people that literally drive 1,000 miles a week.
Yeah, well, I work in New Milford now, so I do a fair amount of driving, because I have to drive to do work after I get to work. So it adds up. 30,000 last year was a lot.
Well, people do drive a lot farther for their employment than they ever did in the 30s.
The town is no longer self-contained. You'd be hard-pressed to do your business in Canaan at this point. Describe what you remember of Canaan Center from the 30s.
Well, I guess my most vivid memories would be of the elm trees.
Really?
I mean, all of Railroad Street and Main Street was just a archway of the tall elms, and it just seems like, you know, one by one they've gone until it's so open now. But the you know, the storefronts haven't really changed all that much. On the corner of Main and Railroad was the old Parsons General Store, which I can remember going in with my mother at probably the age of 4 or 5 years old, and the creaky floor and the bins with fresh oranges in them, and really, truly an old-time general store. And then that was torn down. I'm not sure exactly at what point, but it must have been before World War II, when Andy Fair built the Service Pharmacy building. And I can remember seeing that being built from the cellar hole brick by brick. It was great fun to watch that. But other than a few other changes over on Main Street, all the buildings on Railroad Street, of course with the exception of the old feed mill.
Right, I remember that.
That finally went down in the 50s. But
There were buildings to the north of you, though, weren't there? There was Jim's Garage. Is that where your parking lot is now? Or?
Yep.
Yeah.
There was another building in between there that was the Fuller Hardware warehouse that was built right up close to the tracks, so they could park the freight cars there and flop down a little metal bridge and roll the material right into the warehouse. As I recall, it was not. It was on piers. The floor was up the level of a boxcar.
Yeah.
And that had various lives after Fuller Hardware stopped using it. It was a record store and a sign shop.
Is that where the 10th Muse was?
I believe that.
Yeah. I remember the store, but I can't remember where it was.
And so we actually back in the early days, just to the north of our building, there was room to park about one car, and then the electric company or the phone company had telephone pole storage.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they had concrete piers with pieces of railroad rails perpendicular to the railroad tracks, and they would bring the rail cars in there and roll the logs off on, or the telephone poles onto this storage rack, and then they could come and pick them up with their little trailer and take them out to set them. And there were two lengths of poles there that must have been, I don't know, telephone pole has to be 30 feet high, I guess, so they had two of those storage places there, and there was a little ramp in there that I never saw used, that I don't know what they took off there, whether it was cattle. I'm told that real early they used to unload automobiles there.
Oh, really?
And Model Ts could come down this ramp.
Too much.
But that really was in disrepair and had got so rotten that it finally collapsed. But we were able to buy that. It was that property where the telephone poles were stored was railroad property, and we were able to buy that. I guess that must have been along it was after World War II, in the 40s somewhere. And then we acquired the building that was the warehouse for Fuller Hardware. That was torn down and added to the parking lot. And finally, Jim's Garage was the last acquisition. So
now across the street from you was another garage, and that was a garage for a long time, wasn't it?
that was
What is Jim's now?
Jim's now. It was Ed Stone had a repair garage there, and somewhere along there in the 50s he built a brick building, which is still there. Along there, just north of that, Floyd Knight had his radio and was automotive electric work he did. He had car batteries and fixed starters, and then when TV industry took hold, he went into selling TVs and had a business there until he retired. Funny thing about that was originally the business building was behind his house, and they moved the house behind
Really?
when parking became
a problem.
A real
Just pick up your house and move it.
Right. So and it's still there today in that way. The little store and shop is still there. And right next to that, there's a garage building that's still there that belonged to Charlie Wickwire. And when I was a kid, his business was where the Pizza House is now. And that they worked on cars in there. I guess the building
Goodness, it was an automotive center, wasn't it?
It really was. You know, we were remarking about gasoline stations in Canaan. And right there on Railroad Street, Charlie Wickwire had gasoline, we had gasoline, Stone had gasoline, Jim's Garage had gasoline. That's four, and then the Ford dealer was Casey's garage up where the video store is today. And there was gasoline there. There must have been 5 or 6 gasoline stations.
Within a very tight little area.
You could throw
And
a stone.
now there's none. Yep.
Exactly. And I don't know, there was a gasoline station down around the corner from the post office on the right-hand side. Hugin's had a garage there, and there was gas pumps there. Of course, the old station where Curtis Insurance is now.
Was a gas station, Esso.
Yep, and Harry Schreiber was there for years and years.
And then where the firehouse was, or is, was a
There
gas
was
station.
gasoline there. There were actually where both of the stations are still there were gas stations. There was John Sandrini had a gas station down where the entrance to the golf course, up by Leo Segala's station, and I think there was another one up there across the road where the Pizza House is today.
I don't remember that one.
I don't remember it operating, but I remember the building being there. So that's certainly been a change.
East Canaan had one.
East Canaan had a gas station?
Just by the corner of, is it College Hill?
Down here by where Fred Couch had the station, where you go up the Canaan Valley Road.
Yep.
But
Now, it must have been profitable, and yet people were driving less.
all of those things, I guess, is you got bigger stations, and the number of gallons they had to move, and the way it was delivered to the stations has certainly contributed to all of that. I guess maybe it's more efficient today.
Yeah.
You can.
Well, you look at Jim Mather. He had 3 kids, kept that family very comfortable, apparently, on what he did with his little station, and it wasn't the biggest one in town, but he seemed to do okay.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of amusing because in the real early days with gasoline pumps, where you turned a crank to pump it, a lot of times it was in front of the general store, and that was sort of a sideline to the rest of their business. And then now it's come full circle because all the gas stations have got convenience stores.
And now nobody pumps it for you. You have to get out and freeze your own hands. That was a change I didn't like. I mean, you really can be in trouble now if you need anything more than gas.
Oh, exactly.
It's hard to find a garage that will deal with it.
I guess most people never check their oil anymore, and which I guess attests to the fact that the motors are so much better that you rarely ever do need to add oil unless the car has really been.
Well, they're also suggesting now longer between oil changes. They've gone up from what, 3 to 5 to 7,000.
Yeah, it depends on the way you drive and how much mileage you put on, how quickly you put it on. But I hate to see any car go more than 5,000 miles without an oil change. But no, the center of town has had a slow change that if you've lived through 50, 60 years, it has been a lot of changes, and certainly today with the lack of businesses, I can remember, the drugstore, the service pharmacy, with the movie theater and the bowling alleys. I mean, at 10 o'clock at night,
it was hopping.
There were people on the street. You couldn't get a seat at the soda fountain at the service pharmacy sometimes that late at night, because there were people buying ice cream sodas and sundaes, and the little Louis Nick's little store there by the theater was always busy. Today, no one's on the street that time of night.
Well, you can walk down the middle of the day and there's nobody on the street too. It's changed so dramatically. I mean, when my grandfather had the milk route, we used to stop in Johnny's, which was beside Jim's garage at that time, and now I don't think there's an eatery except the pizza place on that street, is there? There used to be the Colonial Restaurant. That's gone. Used to be Fuller Hardware. That's gone.
Yeah, I mean, most of Main Street of Railroad Street is vacant now, other than the jewelry store, Ronnie Schultz, and of course that was the Badgley building, and there was Badgley's Meat Market.
That's right. I've seen the pictures of that.
And of all things, Decker and Beebe operated out of the other half of that store.
Really?
I mean, can you imagine with the trucks and the equipment, they used to have all of their plumbing parts stored in the basement and lug that stuff out every day when they were going on a job. And of course, the meat market is there was Jack's Market a little further down the street. Both of those.
Mama DeBarberry.
Both of those were able to make a living. And around the corner on Main Street where the People's Bank is now, of course, there were 3 storefronts there, the Collins Jewelry Store and Scott's Barber Shop and another food store, Mather and O'Neill, which is where I had one of my first jobs.
Oh, really?
Packing groceries on the shelves. And what was the lady's name? Was it that worked there? She was a fixture. Marion Rhodes, was it? Not Marion. What was her name? Dear. George Mather. And,
That was Jim's father?
No, that was, yes, that was Jim's father. But that business was there until into the 50s sometime. I don't know when the bank finally did move there.
I think the bank moved somewhere around 52, 53. So they, I don't remember that building at all. I don't remember anything there prior to.
I'll tell you, Scott's Barber Shop, there were 2, sometimes 3 barbers working there.
Yeah.
It was just like a barber shop you see in the movies.
Yeah.
Really.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. And I can remember going there for my first haircut. And there were actually, I guess there were 3 barber shops in town at one point. But the smaller businesses certainly haven't been able to.
Well, it's
survive.
a universal problem. I really don't see the answer to it because it's been an increasing movement towards centralization of services, and now you've got a supermarket now that takes the place of all those small individual shops, and nobody in a little shop could compete with the prices because the profit margin is so narrow on it. I mean, I think they get something like a half a cent in the big supermarkets on some goods, and how could a person who was trying to supply his own insurance and his own unemployment compensation and whatnot operate on a penny margin?
Yeah, exactly, and I agree. I don't see the where there's any solution to it other than at some point personal service does come back and is of value to some people that they're willing to pay to get that kind of service. And I don't know, in the automobile business, we look at it, there's a lot of these big super mall dealerships, but in order to get to one, they need big population centers. They need a lot of traffic and a lot of sales. They advertise a lot. All of that costs money. But if your car breaks down in Canaan and you bought it in East Hartford, not much they're going to do for you. So
and some of them operate on virtually nothing. I had a friend who went shopping for a car and used one of these services that tells you, what the markup is on it and all of that, and managed to bargain it down. So I think the dealer made $12. I mean, really, that didn't pay anybody's.
No, they're just interested in making numbers to please Detroit, I think.
Yeah.
But
well, and I suppose if you sell a gazillion cars, you can afford to take a loss on 1 or 2 of them.
Right.
But
most of those places they get themselves geared to, we'll say, 100 cars a month that they're selling. If there's any kind of a downturn at all, their overhead expenses just eat them alive. And the automobile business is historically up and down and a very cyclical business. It goes in about 5-year cycles usually. There's a boom year, and then it'll trail off for a couple of years, and then it'll keep getting worse, and then you really hit bottom, and then it comes back. And you know, in a straight line, it does average out, but those ups and downs.
Well, and it's also something
can't
that people
support
can
it.
put off buying under most circumstances. So if you get a year that's off financially, you
Sure.
can say, well, I'll get by for another year. And you get a bunch of people saying, I'll get by for another year, and you've got a bad year for cars.
Exactly.
I suspect that recession we had in the late 80s must have done something like that.
1991 was the worst year that we ever saw in the business.
Really?
And but you know, it came back. 92 was a little better. 93 was quite a bit better. Then 94, 95, and still seems to be on the upswing. But
Now, when the thing was started way back when, say in the early 20s, how many employees were there, do you know?
I guess when they first started, just the two brothers here in Canaan, and as a matter of fact, that's how my father got involved. Their first employee was a man that was a cousin to my dad, Kathryn Perkins, and they had lived on the farm up on the road to Mill River, and he was friendly with the Brewer boys, and came down to be a salesman, and built a house here in Canaan, and worked for them until he retired in the 70s. So he was their first employee. But beyond that, in Canaan, I think there was a mechanic that they had after a few years, and finally a bookkeeper, and so it started from meager beginnings. As a matter of fact, we have framed in our office it's an accounting of their assets when they when they first officially became a business, and it totals $268.73, and they had everything counted, from including a pair of pliers for 50 cents.
Oh, really?
And a bumper jack for $1,
Too much.
and a desk for $10, and a 1912 Rio, I think, was also one of their assets. But that's when they started. But at one time, when the company was operating in all the 4 cities, there were about a total of 100 employees.
Wow.
And but we're back down to 12 now in Canaan.
That's still quite a number of people to have working in one
Yeah.
business.
You know, the bigger cities, the branches would have 20 to 25 people. So it got up close to 100 employees altogether.
Do you still have that Rio? Do I remember?
Yes, we still have that. That's a 1905
Wow.
Rio. It's pretty fragile,
Yeah.
but it does still run. It's kind of an effort to get it going,
Yeah.
with a hand crank and a lot of cussing, but it will run, and we used it in parades and driving around town at different times, but it hasn't been out now in more than 10 years.
Really?
Yeah.
I bet it'd be hard to start now.
I'm afraid so.
That's amazing. Where do you keep it?
Well, it's at my mother's in her garage at the moment, covered with plastic. So that's one of the things we always promise we're going to do when the good weather gets
Yeah,
here. But
is take it out.
Never seems to happen.
Now that would need leaded gas, though, wouldn't it?
I don't think that at that stage, how much you'd run it would
Yeah.
ever hurt. It has a 1-cylinder motor, and it under the hood there's a gas tank and a water tank, and the engine is under the seat. And it has a magneto for the ignition, but and it has a self-oiler, one of these big. It's about the size of a quart of oil, and it continually drips into the motor while it's working. So I don't think the motor would be too fussy about what the fuel was. But it's really kind of neat. It's more like a buggy with a motor under the seat. It has a little rumble seat that folds out.
Oh, I think it must be a wonderful car. I'd love to see it someday. Perhaps we ought to take a picture of it, Fred, for the part that we would include on this business. When your great uncles, would they be?
No, they were actually my mother's
Your
brothers.
uncles.
Yeah.
You said that they ran a livery service. Did they have horses in the very early days? Because they...
No.
No?
I guess livery was a term that you'd think of with horses, but no, they never, they left those on the farm.
couldn't get away fast enough.
So, you know, I don't think it was ever, you know, like a taxi business,
Yeah.
but it was more to do these trips into the Berkshires than anything else. But once they got their Rio franchise, I think they got in 1915, and that, you know, then they really started selling cars. But I can remember my dad saying that in the 30s that your business came from finding people that had never owned a car.
Really?
Yeah, that was the trick, to go out and scour the countryside and sell a
Persuade
farmer
somebody.
a car that had never had a car.
Yeah.
But today, of course, everybody's got a car and sometimes want to trade in too.
Yeah.
But they used to take anything from pigs and chickens and trade and to resell to get the sale from the farmers.
Oh, that's too much. I love it. You would actually take animals and trade?
Yeah, they had done that. But I think there was a goat one time. But it was certainly a different business than it is today.
I would think so. And there were no roads.
No, I say it was mostly mud in those days, and well, I think that it wasn't until the 20s that much of the roads around here were
I've
paved.
read accounts somewhere of paving 44, and
Yeah,
it was relatively late in the
I think
20s,
out here
30s.
towards the New York, or towards the Norfolk line was one of the first stretches, and the foot of Smith Hill. Some of that original concrete was in the 1922 or something like that. But I know, I say where our building is on Railroad Street, it was not paved until the 20s. So it was, cars were pretty fragile, and you didn't want to get too far without
And they
a
had to
spare
deal
tire.
deal with more than cars today have to deal with in terms of getting to where you wanted to be.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've often thought about, well, what cars were like in the 30s and what the roads were like. That the people that conceived the idea of the regional high school, I mean, they must have been pretty forward-thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, that had to be in the early 30s that they first started thinking about it. By the mid-30s, they were going ahead with it to get the building built in 1939.
Yeah.
I can remember one of the school buses that we had when I was a kid. We called the cheese box. It was a you know, a square, boxy, little stubby bus with, I guess maybe they had a heater for the driver, but
The rest of you got pretty
on a
cold.
winter day the windows were always steamed up, and you know, those vehicles weren't terribly reliable. But when you think of them picking up the kids in Kent up around in the back country and driving all the way up to Falls Village, it was really quite forward-thinking to develop that back then, because certainly the roads were not, I mean, the back roads were all dirt roads then.
And tires weren't anything near what they are today.
Right.
It's occurred to me a little while ago in thinking about it that blowouts don't seem to be the hazard that they used to be. You used to worry about a car having an accident if you had a flat tire, and I don't think I've ever heard of a recent car doing that.
Blowouts are really rare today. You know, you'd have to hit something in the road to damage the tire badly. And matter of fact, most tire repairs we find today, we discover when the car's being serviced and check the tire pressure. You carry 30, 35 pounds, you'll find a tire with 20 pounds, and you look around and there's a nail in it. And everything from a piece of a rotary lawnmower blade to a kitchen fork. But the tires are really remarkably...
Is that the steel belting that they do, or what
well,
is the cause
I
of
guess the entire construction of it. But a lot of times you won't find whatever was in the tire. It'll puncture the tire and come out, and yet the tire still maintains
a certain level of...
Yeah, 20 pounds of pressure, and still be able to drive. Most people don't even realize they've had a puncture. But yeah, in the old days, you couldn't drive to Hartford and back, I guess, without having 2 or 3 flat tires. We've got some old books that they were published by the early Automobile Club. I mean, really back in the teens, and they gave directions all around for touring around New England. They would, of course, I don't imagine road signs and route numbers were really popular then.
Yeah.
And it would give you landmarks of how to get to Hartford to go to Pittsfield and come to so many miles and see a church and
too much.
take the second fork, and places to stay, and where there were, of course, there were a lot of advertisements in these books as well, but where you could get fuel and where the good restaurants were. So they were thinking about that back right after 1900.
That would be, I never thought about that, but there wouldn't have been road signs the way there are now.
No, when you think of the huge signs as big as a barn door they got today, and people still
miss and go by their exit. Now, just as tires have changed, the motors have become so much more sophisticated. I know that in the old days, you could go out and tinker with your car and fix it and be on your way, but I don't think that's true anymore, is it?
No, I'll tell you, if a mechanic isn't, if he's away from it for 2 years today, you look under the hood and you wouldn't know what anything is. Of course, electronics have come into it so much that they have these smart computers that'll turn your headlights off if you forget, and if the door is open, it does one thing. If the door is closed, it'll do something else. And they don't always, they control when the heat will come on.
Yeah.
It's they have what they call a body computer that knows what everything is happening in the car, and it's really difficult to diagnose if there is a problem, but very reliable, very reliable. The electronic ignition and that sort of thing has been through, well, since the 70s, actually, then 20 years of improvements, and it's really, now they have what they call onboard diagnostics, that it'll trip a light if there's any one of literally probably 100 things that could warn you that the voltage isn't right, or something isn't functioning just right, and even though the car may be performing all right, that the emissions aren't where they should be. And I think going forward, that the cars are going to be so well made that these emissions inspections are hardly necessary.
Really?
They're. I mean, it'll warn you if something's out of it, even if the gas cap isn't tight, because the fumes can leak into the atmosphere.
When I was in France about 5 years ago, I always think the emissions testing is such a pain in the neck because I never get there on time. But it was so obvious to me what a difference it was where it was required and where it wasn't. I mean, the air was really heavy on some of those highways over there, and it's nowhere near that bad, not obviously that bad here.
Well, I noticed just 2 places that it's evident. If you're traveling east in the morning, if you go on 44 toward Hartford, at the top of Avon Mountain, and look toward the city. Years ago, it used to be just a haze, even on the clearest days. The same thing on the Mass Turnpike as you come down the hills toward Springfield, and there really is a difference, and it's definitely cars today are probably 95% better than they were before they started all of that.
Looking forward, what do you think is the future of fuel-driven cars?
Well, I don't know. They're still a long way from having a viable electric car. It's just, unless there's some major breakthrough in battery technology. What seems to be one of the more encouraging things is what they call a hybrid car, where they will have a small motor, gasoline engine, that will that will run a generator or generate electricity somehow and feed a battery. That you may, if you come into the city, you wouldn't have to run that until your battery gets low. Then you run the small motor that would run on a variety of fuels just to keep the batteries charged, but not be strictly an electric car. That seems to be
That would give you more
one direction
range.
that they're going. Really, the range now on the best of the electrics is 100 miles under ideal conditions, flat country, warm climates. Here in New England, with the slush on the road, running a heater, and lights and wipers in the bad weather, the range is cut to about 50 miles before it needs to be recharged.
Wouldn't even get me to work.
Not home anyway.
No, and home's much more important than getting to work. That's fascinating. What a neat family history, though, to start with virtually the beginning of it and taking it into the next
when you
millennium.
look back, it really, it's early 1900s. I mean, we're 86, 7 years of history. Pretty much the extent of the popularity of cars in this country. Hard to think where it may be going from here, but
Well, will it stay in the family, do you think, the business?
we hope to, maybe to get to 100 years. But it's certainly changing, and I guess we've changed with it over the years, but hopefully cars are not going to go out of favor.
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
And I'm sure that in this part of the world, people need a car to get around, and I guess most attempts at public transportation don't seem to.
Well, it's a whole mindset to use public transportation, and I was talking to Peter this morning about going overseas again this year, and I said we could use a rail pass, and both of us looked at each other and thought, no, we don't want to do that. So
Well,
it's
trains are certainly a great way to get around, but you want to, if you can go to New York 3 times a day, but if you need to get to Norfolk, there's no train.
Yep.
And it's, I guess it just has not kept pace with the needs of the public, and the economics of it don't seem to be able to support it. Thinking about that was another thing related to automobiles was after World War II, when Eisenhower was president, and the campaign to start the highway system. And I mean, if you think about the way we travel now over the highways between the major cities and the interstate system. Of course, I know Fred Hall, he likes to take the back roads. He goes on the lowest route number he can find, and we'll travel from here to Ohio and never see an interstate highway. First I thought he was just trying to miss the toll roads, but then...
Well, the old roads are actually more interesting, and it takes you a lot longer to get where you're going, but they're actually more interesting.
Oh, true. That's a fun thing to do, go into an area. You don't have to go very far from home either, and find where some of the old roadways were, and or to stop and read the historical markers. And
I used to take motorcycle trips across the country, and one of the things that my friend liked to do was to pop off the major highway about every hour or so, and we'd wander along on the parallel roads, and it was wonderful. We'd stop in towns and ask where you could get a good lunch, and go where the locals ate, and usually end up in a conversation with somebody. And it's a much different kind of traveling than just tearing down the road.
Right. If you're really interested in history, and you can learn an awful lot, and some of the out of the way places.
So,
well,
I think we've exhausted the topic. Have we exhausted you, Fred? Click.